I have had the privilege of working a lot with a spiritual leader named Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. And one of the things that Rev often says is that there will be no liberation for anyone without liberation for everyone. And I believe that that's true, whether we're talking about white supremacy, whether we're talking about climate change, pollution, other forms of structural violence, that there will be no liberation or no freedom from those things for anyone without liberation for everyone.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is in collaboration with Ashoka Canada, a global network of leading changemakers and social entrepreneurs. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by Jessica Clogg, who is the Executive Director and Senior Counsel of the nonprofit law organization West Coast Environmental Law, where she has worked as an environmental and Indigenous rights lawyer for the past 25 years. Jessica is also the co-founder of West Coast's Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Land, Air, and Water program. Through co-learning, community dialogue, and legal support, the organization seeks to advance Indigenous law-based strategies to better care for the planet and people. Jessica holds a joint master's in environmental studies and law degree from Osgoode Hall at York, and her Ashoka Fellowship recognizes her work that bridges Canadian and Indigenous legal traditions. In 2020, she was voted one of the top 25 most influential lawyers in Canada by Canadian Lawyer magazine. Welcome to the show, Jessica.
Hello.
It's great to have you. Thank you so much for making the time. I love to start with the origin story. So could you take us back to whatever twists and turns would help us understand why you chose to do the work that you're doing?
Well, what comes to mind to me is actually going back to the year I graduated from law school, which was 1997, and it was the year that the Delgamuukw decision came down from the Supreme Court of Canada. And that was one of the first decisions that recognized that Aboriginal title continued to exist in British Columbia. And one of the first things that I was responsible for as a newly minted lawyer was traveling around the province and doing workshops about what these new legal principles might help, how they might help in addressing harmful logging that was going on in a lot of Indigenous communities. And as I was present in community, as I listened, what came into focus really quickly for me was that much more important than teaching anyone about Canadian law was the fact that each of these peoples already had their own laws, their own responsibilities arising from their inherent jurisdiction and connection to their lands and waters. And so that really grounded everything that's come since then in terms of understanding my role as a Canadian trained lawyer as being much more about translating or bridging between these legal orders, between Indigenous and Canadian law, and really being in service of Indigenous self-determination and environmental justice.
So for those, including me, that has heard the frame Indigenous law, you're bridging both. And I think I recently interviewed a woman who said it's not like there's two traditions coming, you're trying to meld them, but it's more like a zipper. She described the metaphor. Could you just at a high level explain what Indigenous law is about? I don't even know if I can ask it that way, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we started with a premise that that all societies have law. There's principles, there's guidance about how we need to be in relationship with each other and with the planet, whether that's written into the criminal code or in some other way. So when we talk about Indigenous law, we're talking about the laws that come from Indigenous peoples' own traditions and relationships with their territories. This might be natural law that we learn from the world around us. It might be law that's embedded in art or in stories, what might sometimes be called legends or traditional narratives. And just like a Canadian court decision, which in which a judge says looks at a conflict, applies the cases or the stories that have come before to offer guidance about how this particular conflict should be resolved. Indigenous law also holds those teachings that have existed since time immemorial, and offer guidance today about how we should live our lives and how we should be in relationship with each other and with the planet.
Yeah. And can I assume that, are you non-Indigenous? Is that
I
right?
am. I'm a white-bodied person, settler.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm curious to know, if this is not too personal, but how has your personal life or worldview evolved or changed at all as a result of you being exposed to Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous law? I'm curious on a personal level.
Hmm. I mean, I should say first that I'm walking in this world, sort of bridging between these different legal traditions very humbly, with only a very sort of beginning knowledge, and very much recognizing the Indigenous knowledge holders that I work with as experts in their own legal traditions. I sometimes say I have the best job in the world, because I have the chance to spend time in community, listening to story and talking with folks about the teachings that those Indigenous stories offer to help us live our lives in a good way today. And so each of those legal traditions, though, are distinct. You can't sort of universalize, but in each opportunity that I've had to work with elders and read the stories, I've learned something, about myself. Um, a specific example, here in Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, there's Coast Salish or Halkominum law, and one of the key teachings that's been shared with me is that each of us has a gift within us, and that our work is to find that gift and to bring it out in the best way possible. And that if we do that, that's our work in the world, and we need the gifts of all in order to live good lives, and in order to be in good relationship with each other. So that would be one example.
Beautiful. I guess that precedes all of the self-help books that exist in
Mm.
regular Indigos and chapter, right? And why wouldn't it be the case? If I was having a conversation about the biomimicry, how helpful it is to look at, the natural systems. Spider webs inform us on how to build bridges. And a good friend of mine works with horses and always talks about how, the herd, everybody has a role to play, and the alpha male's role is to bring out the best in the herd. And
Mm.
I think that's just, it really strikes me. So when I hear you say that,
Mm.
it feels like, well, of course, that's the way to do it, right? Of course. Beautiful. Okay, so your organization, West Coast Environmental Law, what is the mission, and how does it work to ensure equality and inclusion?
Mm. Well, West Coast has been around for a long time. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And I mean, we sometimes say that West Coast environmental law is committed to transforming the legal landscape in ways that are more sustainable, more democratic, and more just. So part of what's embedded within that is that we don't just use the law as it exists, but we work to actually transform it and to create systemic change. And within that, we work from the premise that in order to create resilient, effective solutions, it's going to require that all voices are heard, that the perspectives of diverse communities are heard and woven into the solutions. And only by doing that will we have resilient solutions, and really be effective in our work for people on the planet.
Oh, wow, beautiful. And it was founded in BC?
Yep, 1974.
Oh, yeah, okay. Exactly 1 year after so 50 years. Bravo.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's
And
amazing.
although I haven't been here for 50 years, this is my 30th year with the organization. So I started out as a summer student in the mid 90s. So also a big part of my own journey.
Oh, wow. And let me just ask, again, forgive the naivete of the question, but maybe others who are listening or watching might appreciate the fact that they also don't know the answer. I hear about law, not quite class action suits, but like young people who are suing their provincial government or their municipality for like their
Mhm.
futures. Is that some of the work that you do?
Yeah, very much so. So one of the key, like one of our, a couple of key things about the way we work, first of all, is about trying to put the law into the hands of communities, but also about creating risk for those who are acting unsustainably. So yes, one of our biggest campaigns is called Sue Big Oil, and it's a sort of a grassroots movement that we've been shaping and guiding, where local communities are coming together and encouraging their local governments to set aside some resourcing to join a class action suit to sue Big Oil to cover the costs that their communities are facing from things like wildfire, flooding, etc. So yeah, that's one of our big campaigns.
And I guess they'll start paying attention when they don't get insurance to cover the legal fees or the costs of the
Yeah.
damages,
Yeah,
right?
you put your finger on something that all of those things that affect the flows of money are often what we need to sort of tap into or influence to get the ear of corporate actors, for example, who are always thinking about their bottom line.
Line, got it. Yeah. Now, of course, when many of us think of lawyers, we're thinking of like, TV and courtroom dramas. Could you share, if anything, like how is your work different?
I think it's quite different because I think part of what my journey here at West Coast has been, and as an executive director, is about modeling and nurturing a new way or a different way of lawyering. Um, we try and take a trauma-informed approach, so really centering the self-determination of the folks we're working with, their own choice, being aware of barriers in access to justice, that the law itself is not neutral, has been a source of harm and damage in society, and really decentering our power. For example, we don't have retainer agreements. We have co-learning agreements that kind of recognize, in particular, Indigenous folks as experts in their own laws, and us as learning alongside them as we try and make strategic choices about how to uphold the decisions they've made about their territories. And I mean, I think we also foundationally see law as being about a process of dialogue and collaborative decision making about responsible human behavior in relation to the natural world and to each other, rather than a sort of top down, sort of legalistic approach that really, at the end of the day, that's what law is about. It's about being in dialogue about the kind of norms that we want to see in our society to care well for each other.
Yeah. And I'm thinking that, I mean, a personal belief that I have is that there are many reasons for the rise of mental health issues, especially among youth, but one of them has to be at a subconscious level, um, a reflection of how our earth is suffering, the earth, the planet that gives us
Yeah.
life and breath and all of that. And that, there's this entropy and we just feel it in our hearts. And I'm also hopeful at the same time
Mhm.
that the Indigenous communities are actually like a really big ray of light because at least in Canada, I don't know about everywhere else in the world. I don't know, maybe you could speak to what's going on in North America or elsewhere in South America or elsewhere. But there seems to be, thankfully, because governments are beginning to repair and reconcile relationships with Indigenous people, there's conversations around land and that the Indigenous people are going to be protecting the land. So it's almost like the Indigenous communities, not that it's their responsibility, but that there's a sense that thanks to their long-standing tradition of relation to the planet, that they actually might provide a strategic entry to protecting our biodiversity. Is that true, or am I making that up?
Well, on one hand, I think it's obviously important not to universalize. There's diversity in perspectives and choices within Indigenous communities as within any community. But I think what we do know is that Indigenous law-based approaches are tried and true. Like essentially the environment we live in, the species that thrive here, that arises because of millennia of Indigenous governance according to Indigenous law. In other words, management of territories according to Indigenous law created the conditions that allowed all species to thrive, that gave us the clean water that some places still have, and that therefore those legal traditions contain some really tried and true and important guidance that can support all of us in living more sustainably.
Do you believe that there'll be a critical mass of people that will save the planet in time? Are you hopeful?
I take hope, I think, in smaller ways. I have the chance often to be in community in multi-generational groups where I see youth learning from the past and weaving that together with, things they're learning in school and what they're learning on the land. And when I'm with those groups who are taking action, in their backyard and really restoring and healing and building something new in that really tangible way. In those times, I feel hope.
I guess part of that is deploying environmental justice, right? So it's a word, it's a frame that I've heard before. I wonder technically if you could describe what that means. What is environmental justice?
Well, environmental justice starts from the understanding uh, that there are folks who are disproportionately impacted by environmental harms, by climate change, because of their social location or their geographic location, because of factors like race, economic status, health, other intersectional things that are impacting them. That because there's folks who are disproportionately impacted by those harms, that there's a critical need to center their vision, their voices, those voices and vision of frontline communities in environmental decision making and in building solutions to address those environmental harms.
Great. Yeah, I think we can, I'd like to believe we can all get behind that. Why is there so much resistance? There's that power thing. So why does an equitable and inclusive approach to environmental activism matter?
I have had the privilege of working a lot with a spiritual leader named Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams. And one of the things that Rev often says is that there will be no liberation for anyone without liberation for everyone. And I believe that that's true, whether we're talking about white supremacy, whether we're talking about climate change, pollution, other forms of structural violence, that there will be no liberation or no freedom from those things for anyone without liberation for everyone. In other words, that means that all voices needs to be heard. It means that we need to be centering those who are most marginalized or disregarded amongst us. And that's really the only way that we can ensure that those unique gifts that each person has can be woven into solutions that work for everyone. And I would say that also includes being inclusive of the more than human beings around us, that we're connected through the greater web of life. And so to me, that's what an equitable, inclusive approach to environmental justice means.
And that is your life's purpose.
Mm.
That work. I love that.
Yeah, maybe multiple lifetimes.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I guess that's sort of like an interesting segue to something that I've become increasingly interested in, which is the IDG framework. So the Inner Development Goals is meant to complement the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? So I think we're familiar with the UN SDGs. I was rather disheartened to learn that we're only about 12% at rate of achievement of those goals with 6 years to go. And I think the IDGs were conceived in part as a response to that. Like, so, if the entire globe is committed to sort of making inroads on 17, interlocking goals, why haven't we made enough progress despite COVID and all of that? And the response from the group that came together to co-create these IDGs is that needs to be more inner work if we're
Mhm.
going to create the change that we want to see. So it's very much the Gandhian be the change. And there are these 23 skills within the framework. So I'm curious if you're familiar with them at all. And if you see yourself as a leader, which of the skills you have used a lot, what you tend to gravitate towards, what you want to develop as a skill. I just want to kind of engage you on those IDGs for a sec.
For sure. And I want to say thank you for introducing me to them. Really appreciated learning a bit about it, and just really acknowledging uh, and sort of celebrating that idea of bringing together inner development and outer sustainability, because I think that that's just so critical. There were a few things that came up for me as I was just sort of beginning the journey of learning a little bit more. Um, I very much agree that that relationship to self is an important starting point. But one of the things that has been part of my learning journey is thinking about the interplay between self and sort of more systemic and structural factors. And that, like for me, as a sort of white-bodied, quite privileged person, to show up without causing harm also requires kind of going to get those parts of myself that I may have left behind. And for each of us, that's a little bit different. I mean, it can be internalized colonialism, internalized white supremacy, but just recognizing that we don't, like that as individuals, that our own work is always intertwined with those structural pieces, and understanding how they've acted upon us, so that we can kind of move forward as our full selves. The other thing that that I thought was really interesting, I sort of the second piece there around thinking or cognitive skills, that's sort of the next phase out. What came up for me in thinking about that is that how much in Western societies we tend to gravitate towards privileging the mind or the intellect. And so the one something that I would have liked to have seen more of is balancing of that thinking, that cognitive piece, with the spiritual, with the emotional, with our physical selves. For example, the ability to access embodied knowing that each of us has, or the work that happens when we understand it at an emotional level, when we're being triggered, where our unconscious sort of flight or fight response is kicking in, and it makes it hard for us to show up well. So, it's interesting. I know I'm drawn, it's, my training, it's, my upbringing, that I'm drawn towards that cognitive side. But I know my work is often about balancing with the spiritual, the emotional, the physical. And I would love to see that, woven more into the framework. And it may be just that I'm just getting to know it a little bit. But those were some of the things that came up for me in my, just very initial diving into it.
Well, if you're interested, because I attended the conference last fall in Stockholm, and at one point it was an incredible array of speakers and like-minded souls all there with, I felt great volition to lean into being the change and for the change that the world needs. They did a little exercise where everybody, opened up their phone and responded to some questions about, like, what's missing here? What are your hesitations? What do you think we're not getting quite? And they crowdsourced the responses in real time, and they kind of put up 5 buckets that you could almost predict, right? There's not enough diversity here. A bunch of things like what you were saying, the embodied emotional affective side of what it means to be human, sensing, things like reconciliation and forgiveness that was not a skill, that from the Canadian context would almost be sort of blatant. And I felt reassured that even though they've put out the framework, that they're right now in the process of getting at least a minimum million people from around the world
Wow.
to provide feedback,
Yeah.
so that they can, iterate on this. And I think it's meant to be an open source framework where people will recognize that, there's some things missing, some gaps, and so I'm not.
I love it. I love it. That's so exciting.
Great. Okay. So stay tuned. And I take your feedback very seriously because I want to write about the IDG framework. And the plan was to take this, 23 skills and see what the leading Western science had to say about courage or about, long-term thinking. And all the interviews that I've done with the Ashoka Fellows has pointed to how I have to also turn towards Indigenous wisdom and see what they have to say about this inner development work. So that for me is a brand new piece of research that that you've only affirmed through our conversation. So yeah, so thank you for that. Jessica, how has it changed your work to be, or at all, has it had an impact on your organization to be among the Ashoka Fellowship community?
I appreciated, you'd encouraged me to reflect on that. And I was one of the first Canadian fellows, quite a number of years ago. And, looking back, I would say that the biggest impact was the invitation to scale up the work. So a lot in Ashoka, they often talk about sort of an idea and then about scaling up. And for me, that was kind of going from this very deep, very specific work with particular Indigenous nations and communities, and rising to that invitation to launch what ultimately became the RELAW, or the Revitalizing Indigenous Law for Land, Air, and Water program, like as an approach to expressing or applying and enforcing Indigenous law that could be of use to a wider circle of people, and that people could continue to learn together about. And so I don't think without that invitation from Ashoka that I would have felt called to rise to that occasion. And so I'm yeah, extremely grateful for that.
So they were thinking bigger for you.
Yeah. In fact, I think I even recall I might have had like a remedial. I think I had to report back about how I was going to scale things up, and it was really important in the work.
Lovely. Jessica, last question, and thank you so much for engaging in this conversation and sharing what the work is, and I think inspiring some other people to take a look at environmental justice and Indigenous justice and Indigenous law. I ask this of all my podcast guests, and that is, if you can think of a time in your life where you've been on the receiving end of empathy and what that has meant for you.
The first thing that brings up for me is actually like almost a cautionary note. I'm so cognizant that as a person with a lot of positional power, as an ED, and privilege as a white-bodied person, that that empathizing with me or tending to my emotional needs just isn't the work of my staff or the partners we work with, and that I actually need to be resilient enough to engage in the work without that expectation. That said, there have definitely been moments when I have felt unconditional love from others, and that feeling of mutual understanding and feeling that I think embodies deep empathy. And what came to mind is actually like every evening after our bedtime routine, my youngest daughter sort of bends over and kisses me on the forehead and just says, "I love you so much, Mommy," and that's enough.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Thank you for sharing that, Jessica. That's beautiful. That is really beautiful. How old is she?
She's 13 now.
Still saying it? Nice. Well done, Mom. Mine's turning 8. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. My mom has a distinct memory of me at one point walking in the hallway somewhere, I guess maybe in a shopping mall, and I let her hand go and I said, "Mom." I'm like, "Mom." And for her, it was just this painful moment. So anyways, want to thank you so much for all the work that you do, all the work your organization is doing, 50 years and counting. I won't put the burden of saying we're counting on you, but we are definitely behind you. And I look forward to disseminating this conversation, putting a lot of links where people can get more information, and just continue pursuing and supporting and allying with the important work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for listening and watching. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. I want to extend a special thanks to Ashoka Canada for their support. Ashoka Canada is dedicated to fostering social innovation and supporting Canada's highest impact social entrepreneurs. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you'll hit the subscribe button, and we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.